Victoria Sterling slammed her designer purse on the marble reception desk so hard that the security guard nearly dropped his coffee. Her expensive heels clicked like gunshots across the polished floor of Sterling Industries' main lobby. The board meeting had been a disaster, again. "Another waste of my time," she muttered, pulling out her phone to check the endless stream of messages. 3 more potential suitors had sent their profiles through her assistant. A tech entrepreneur who talked only about cryptocurrency. A lawyer who seemed more interested in her company's legal structure than getting to know her. And worst of all, a hedge fund manager who had the nerve to suggest she should consider stepping back from running her own company after marriage. Victoria was 32 years old and had built Sterling Industries from a small family business into a multinational corporation. She employed over 5,000 people across 12 countries. Forbes had featured her on their cover twice. Yet somehow, finding a decent man felt harder than closing a billion-dollar merger. The lobby was mostly empty at this hour. Most employees had gone home, leaving only the security desk manned and the usual evening cleaning crew preparing for their night shift. Victoria barely noticed these people. They were part of the building's background, like the expensive art on the walls or the imported Italian marble under her feet. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her mother asking about wedding plans that didn't exist. Victoria's frustration finally boiled over. "I'm so sick of this," she shouted to the empty lobby, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "These men are absolutely useless. None of them have any culture, any soul, any real talent." The security guard looked up nervously. He'd worked here for 8 years and had never seen Miss Sterling lose her composure like this. She was always controlled, always professional, always intimidating in her perfect composure. Victoria began pacing back and forth across the lobby, her anger building with each step. "You want to know what I really want? I want a man with actual talent, someone who can appreciate beautiful things, someone who understands art and music." She stopped suddenly in the middle of the lobby and threw her arms up dramatically. "Fine, you know what? If any man in this entire building can play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 perfectly, I'll marry him. Right here, right now. No questions asked." Her voice carried through the lobby and down the hallways. The security guard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd heard stranger things from executives working late, but this was definitely a first. "I mean it," Victoria continued, now addressing the empty lobby as if it were full of potential suitors. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It's one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. If someone can play it with real feeling, real understanding, then they're worth my time." She pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. "I'm putting this in writing. Janet can send it to the whole company if she wants. Maybe it'll weed out the gold diggers and the idiots." The security guard cleared his throat carefully. Miss Sterling? Are you okay?" Victoria looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. She straightened her jacket and smoothed her hair, suddenly aware of how she must look. "I'm fine, Robert. Just, frustrated with the dating scene, you understand." Robert nodded politely, though he couldn't imagine having the kind of problems that came with being a billionaire CEO. His own dating concerns were more along the lines of affording dinner at Olive Garden. "Of course, ma'am. Is there anything I can do to help?" Victoria waved him off. No. I just need to get home and forget about this whole day." She gathered her purse and started walking toward the elevator, her heels still clicking authoritatively on the marble. As she waited for the elevator doors to open, she called back to Robert. "If anyone asks about my little outburst, just tell them I was rehearsing for a play or something." Robert nodded. "Of course, Miss Sterling. Have a good evening." The elevator doors closed and Victoria disappeared upward toward the executive parking garage. Robert shook his head and went back to his evening newspaper. He'd seen plenty of strange things working security at a major corporation, but this would definitely make for an interesting story to tell his wife. What Robert didn't notice was the figure standing in the shadows near the far hallway. Diego Morales had been mopping the same section of floor for the past 10 minutes. moving his mop in slow, methodical strokes while listening to every word of Victoria Sterling's dramatic outburst. Diego was 34 years old, though the stress of the past few years had added extra lines around his eyes. He'd been working as a night janitor at Sterling Industries for 3 years, starting his shift at 6 p.m. and finishing at 2 a.m. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to cover his mother's medical bills and keep food on the table. Most people in the building didn't notice Diego. He was part of the invisible workforce that kept the corporate world running. He emptied trash cans, cleaned bathrooms, vacuumed offices, and polished floors. Executive assistants might nod politely if they worked late enough to see him, but the executives themselves rarely acknowledged his existence. That suited Diego just fine. He preferred to work quietly, lost in his own thoughts, dreaming of a different life while his hands did the familiar work of cleaning, but tonight was different. Tonight, Victoria Sterling had mentioned Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Diego leaned on his mop handle and closed his eyes. He could hear the piece in his mind, every note as clear as if he were sitting at a piano bench. The opening measures, so deceptively simple. The way the melody built and twisted, full of passion and heartbreak. The technical challenges that had taken him months to master. The way the piece ended like a question that could never be fully answered. He hadn't played it in almost 5 years. He hadn't touched a piano at all in 5 years. Diego opened his eyes and looked around. The empty lobby. Miss Sterling was gone. Robert was reading his paper. The marble floors gleamed under the soft evening lights. Everything looked exactly the same as it did every night, but something had changed. For the first time in years, Diego found himself wondering what would happen. If he took Victoria Sterling at her word, he shook his head and went back to mopping. It was a crazy idea. She hadn't meant it seriously. People like Victoria Sterling didn't marry janitors, no matter how well they could play piano. But as Diego worked his way through the rest of the lobby, he couldn't stop thinking about those familiar notes. His fingers started moving against the mop handle, unconsciously playing the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1. For just a moment, the lobby faded away, and Diego was back where he belonged, at a piano bench with music flowing through his fingers like water. Then he caught himself and focused on his work. Dreams were dangerous things for a man in his position. Better to keep them locked away, where they couldn't hurt him anymore. But Victoria Sterling's words echoed in his mind for the rest of his shift. And for the first time in years, Diego found himself humming as he worked. Diego's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the mop handle tighter. The lobby had fallen silent except for the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning system. Victoria Sterling's words kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. Chopin's Ballade No. 1. He hadn't heard anyone mention that piece in years. He forced himself to continue mopping, moving in slow, steady circles across the marble floor. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from this corporate lobby, far from the smell of cleaning chemicals and the weight of his janitor's uniform. His mind was in a practice room at Juilliard. 10 years ago, back then, Diego had been a different person. Back then, he'd worn tailored shirts instead of work uniforms. His hands had been soft and precise, trained for nothing but coaxing music from ivory keys. He'd been 24 years old and full of dreams that seemed completely achievable. The scholarship to Juilliard had been the proudest moment of his life. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, Diego had learned to play on an old upright piano in his church basement. His mother, Carmen, had worked double shifts at a textile factory to pay for his lessons. She'd sit in the back of every recital, her factory uniform still smelling like machine oil, tears streaming down her face as her son played. "Mio, you have magic in your fingers," she'd tell him afterward, hugging him tight despite her exhaustion. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that music isn't a real career. You're going to play for kings and queens someday." At Juilliard, Diego had been a star. His professors called him a natural, someone who didn't just play music, but truly understood it. Chopin had been his specialty. Something about the Polish composer's emotional depth spoke to Diego in a way that other music couldn't. He could feel Chopin's own struggles in every note, The way beauty and sadness could exist in the same moment, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 had been his signature piece. The composition that had earned him first place in 3 major competitions. The piece he'd planned to play for his senior recital, the one that would launch his professional career. Diego paused his mopping and looked down at his hands. They were rough now, with calluses from years of physical labor. His nails were short and practical, nothing like the carefully maintained fingers of a concert pianist. But he could still remember how it felt to play that piece. The way his left hand would dance across the bass notes while his right hand sang the melody. The technical passages that had taken months to perfect, until they felt as natural as breathing. He remembered the day he'd first played it perfectly, all the way through, without a single mistake. His professor, Dr. Weinstein, had been sitting in the corner of the practice room, listening with his eyes closed. When Diego finished, there had been a long silence. "That," Dr. Weinstein had said finally, "is what music is supposed to sound." Like Diego had felt like he was flying. This was it. This was his moment. His future stretched out before him like a golden road. Concert halls, recording contracts, international tours. All of it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. That was before the phone call that changed everything. Diego shook his head, trying to push away the memories. But they kept coming, as clear and painful as they'd been 5 years ago. His mother's voice on the phone, weak and frightened. The doctor's words she repeated, "Stage 3 cancer. Aggressive treatment needed immediately. Insurance that would cover only a fraction of the costs." Diego had been in his final year at Juilliard when he got that call. He'd been preparing for his senior recital, the performance that would determine his entire future. Talent scouts were expected to attend. Record labels had already shown interest, but none of that mattered when his mother needed him. The decision had been impossible. And immediate. Diego dropped out of Juilliard 3 months before graduation. He'd sold his piano, cashed out his small savings account, and moved back home to take care of Carmen and work. Whatever jobs would pay the medical bills, the first job had been at a restaurant, washing dishes for 12 hours a day. Then construction work, when the restaurant couldn't give him enough hours. Then night security, when his mother's treatment schedule made day jobs impossible. Finally, janitorial work, which paid better than he'd expected and gave him health. Insurance that helped with Carmen's ongoing medical costs. 5 years had passed since he'd played a single note. 5 years of watching his mother slowly recover while his own dreams withered away. Carmen was healthy now, thanks to the treatment he'd been able to afford with his sacrifice. She worked part-time at a grocery store and constantly worried about her son's happiness. "Mio, when are you going back to music?" She'd ask him every time he visited. "Your hands weren't made for mopping floors." "Music doesn't pay the bills, Mama," he'd always reply. "I'm fine, I'm happy." It was only half a lie. He was grateful his mother was alive and healthy, but happy. Diego couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly happy, standing in the empty lobby of Sterling Industries. Holding a mop and wearing a janitor's uniform, Diego allowed himself to really think about Victoria Sterling's challenge for the first time. Could he still play Chopin's Ballade No. 1? His fingers began moving unconsciously against the mop handle, playing the opening measures in the air. Muscle memory was a strange thing. His hands seemed to remember what his mind had tried to forget. The piece was approximately 15 minutes long. It started simply, almost conversationally, like Chopin was introducing the main theme to a friend. Then it built, becoming more complex, more emotional, more technically demanding. There were passages that required years of practice to execute properly. Sections where the left hand and right hand had to move completely independently, like two different people having a conversation, but Diego had once known every note by heart. He'd played it hundreds of times, maybe thousands. It had been burned into his muscle memory so deeply that sometimes he'd catch himself playing it on his thigh while riding the subway, his fingers moving automatically while his mind wandered. The question wasn't whether he could remember it. The question was whether his hands could still do what his memory demanded. Diego looked around the empty lobby again. Victoria Sterling was long gone, probably back in her penthouse apartment, having forgotten all about her dramatic challenge. She'd been angry, frustrated with her dating life. People said all kinds of things when they were upset, but what if she'd meant it? What if someone really could change his entire life by playing one piece of music? Diego almost laughed at himself. It was a fantasy, nothing more. Billionaire CEOs didn't marry janitors, no matter how well they played piano. Things like that only happened in movies. But as he finished mopping the lobby and moved on to the next area of the building, Diego couldn't stop thinking about those familiar notes. For the first time in 5 years, he found himself wondering if there might be a piano somewhere in this building. And if there was, whether his hands could still remember how to make magic. For 3 days, Diego couldn't focus on anything. He went through the motions of his work like a man sleepwalking. Empty trash cans, mop floors, clean windows, vacuum carpets. The same routine he'd followed for 3 years, but now his mind was somewhere else entirely. Victoria Sterling's words had awakened something inside him that he'd thought was dead and buried. Every time he cleaned near the executive offices, he found himself looking around for her, wondering if she remembered what she'd said, wondering if she'd meant any of it. "Hey, Diego!" His supervisor, Frank Martinez, called out Tuesday evening as Diego was preparing his cleaning cart. "You feeling okay, man? You seem distracted lately?" Frank was a good supervisor, the kind who actually cared about his employees. He'd worked his way up from janitor to building operations manager over 15 years, and he understood the challenges that came with this kind of work. "I'm fine, Frank," Diego replied, checking his supply of cleaning products. "Just tired, I guess." "You sure?" "Because yesterday I had to ask you twice to clean the conference room on the 10th floor. And this morning, security mentioned you left your cart in the lobby for 20 minutes without moving it." Diego felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd been standing in that lobby, staring at the spot where Victoria Sterling had made her. Challenged, lost in memories of music and dreams he'd given up. "Sorry about that. It won't happen again." Frank studied him for a moment. "Look, I know this job isn't exactly exciting. But you're one of my best workers, Diego. Reliable, thorough, professional. I don't want to see you burning out on me." "I'm not burning out," Diego said quickly. "Really, I'm fine." Frank didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. "Okay, but if something's bothering you, you can talk to me. Sometimes this work gets to people. The hours, the isolation, feeling invisible. It's normal, feeling invisible." That phrase stuck with Diego as he began his rounds that night. Frank was right. For 3 years, Diego had been essentially invisible in this building. He cleaned around important meetings, emptied trash cans, full of million-dollar deal documents, polished floors that executives walked across without ever looking down. But Victoria Sterling had looked right at him that first night. Not at him specifically, but she'd spoken to the building itself, to anyone who might be listening. And Diego had been listening. Wednesday night was worse. Diego found himself making mistakes he'd never made before. He forgot to restock the paper towels in 3 different bathrooms. He knocked over a plant while vacuuming, spilling dirt across a carpet he'd just cleaned. Worst of all, he accidentally left his master key in the lock of an office door, only remembering when he was 2 floors away. Frank pulled him aside after that. "Okay, that's it," Frank said, his voice concerned but firm. "Something's definitely going on with you. You want to tell me what it is, or do I need to write you up for safety violations?" Diego had never been written up in 3 years of work. The thought of having a disciplinary note in his file made his stomach turn. But how could he explain what was really bothering him? How could he tell Frank that he was obsessing over a dramatic outburst from the CEO, a woman who probably didn't even know his name? "It's family stuff," Diego said finally. It wasn't entirely a lie. His mother had been asking more questions lately. About his happiness, about whether he ever missed music. She's been pushing me to make some changes in my life." Frank's expression softened. He knew about Carmen's medical history, knew that Diego's job was largely about supporting his mother's ongoing healthcare needs. "Is she okay, health-wise, I mean?" "Yeah, she's fine, healthy. It's just Diego struggled to find the right words. She wants me to pursue some old dreams that I had to give up when she got sick. She feels guilty about it. That was completely true. Carmen did feel guilty, though Diego had never blamed her for his choices. How could he? She was his mother, and she'd needed him. End of story. What kind of dreams? Frank asked. Diego hesitated. He'd never told anyone at work about his musical background. It seemed too far removed from his current life, too painful to discuss. Music, he said quietly. I used to be a musician. Before Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. No kidding? What kind of music? Classical piano. I was pretty good at it. Huh. Frank studied him with new interest. You know, there's a piano in the executive conference room on the 20th floor. Beautiful instrument. Gets tuned twice a year, but I don't think anyone ever plays it. Diego's heart jumped. He'd been wondering about that for 3 days. He cleaned every floor of the building over the past 3 years, but the executive conference room was only cleaned during special events when important clients were visiting. Really? Yeah, big black grand piano. Probably costs more than my car. Miss Sterling had it installed when they renovated that floor 2 years ago. Said it was for entertaining clients, but mostly it just sits there looking expensive. Frank paused, seeming to consider something. You know what? You should see it sometime. 21st floor, room 2105? Maybe seeing a piano again would help you figure out what you want to do about your mom's concerns. Diego nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. Maybe I will, but inside his heart was racing. There was a piano in the building. A grand piano on the executive floor, probably just 20 floors above where he was standing. Thursday night, Diego couldn't concentrate at all. Every time he cleaned near the elevators, he found himself looking up at the floor indicators, thinking about that piano. Frank had said room 2105. Diego had master key access to every room in the building except the most sensitive executive offices. Carmen called him Thursday afternoon, just as he was getting ready for work. Mio, you sound different lately, she said, distracted. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Mama. You know I can tell when you're lying, right? I raised you. Diego smiled despite himself. Carmen had an uncanny ability to read his moods. Even over the phone? I've just been thinking about some things you said, about music, about whether I ever miss it. There was a long pause. When Carmen spoke again, her voice was soft and careful. Do you miss it? The question hit Diego harder than he'd expected. For 5 years, he'd told himself that he'd made peace with his choice. That music had been a young man's dream, and he was an adult now with adult responsibilities. That he was happy with his practical, steady life, but Victoria Sterling's challenge had cracked open something inside him. The truth was, he missed music every single day. He missed the feeling of sitting at a piano bench, of feeling a piece of music come alive under his fingers. He missed the way time seemed to stop when he played, the way the rest of the world disappeared, and there was nothing but sound and emotion and the perfect communication between his mind and his hands. Yeah, Mama, he said quietly. I miss it. A lot. Oh, Mio. Carmen's voice was thick with emotion. I never wanted you to give it up. Not for me. I know. But I had to, and I don't regret it. You're healthy now, and that's what matters. But what about your happiness? What about your dreams? Diego closed his eyes. Dreams don't pay medical bills. The medical bills are paid, Diego. I'm healthy. I have insurance through my job now. You don't have to sacrifice your whole life for decisions we made 5 years ago. After the call ended, Diego sat in his small apartment, staring at the wall. His mother was right. The immediate crisis that had forced him to abandon music was over. Carmen was healthy and stable. The crushing medical debt had been paid off, for the first time in 5 years. Diego allowed himself to really think about the future. Not just getting through the next month or paying the next bill, but actually imagining what he wanted his life to look like. And for the first time in 5 years, that future included music. That night at work, Diego made his decision. He was going to find that piano. He was going to see if his hands remembered what his heart had never forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, he was going to find the courage to take Victoria Sterling at her word, even if it was the craziest thing he'd ever done in his life. Friday night, Diego finished his regular cleaning rounds earlier than usual. His heart had been pounding all day, knowing that tonight he would finally see the piano Frank had mentioned, room 2105 on the 20th floor. He'd checked his master key ring 3 times to make sure he had access. The building was quieter than usual. Most of the late-working executives had gone home, leaving only security guards and the night-cleaning crew. Diego took the elevator to the 20th floor, his hands slightly shaking as the numbers climbed higher. The executive floor was a different world from the rest of the building. Everything was more expensive here. Thick carpets that cost more per square foot than most people made in a month. Original artwork on the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows with breathtaking views of the city. Room 2105 was at the end of a long hallway lined with smaller conference rooms. Diego approached the door slowly, almost afraid of what he might find inside. What if the piano was broken? What if it was locked somehow? What if this whole idea was just a fantasy he'd built up in his mind? He slipped his key into the lock and turned it carefully. The door opened with a soft click. Diego stepped inside and turned on the lights. The conference room was magnificent. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Diego made in 6 months. Abstract paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum. And there, in the corner by the windows, was the most beautiful piano Diego had ever seen. It was a Steinway Model D Concert Grand, 9 feet of polished ebony that seemed to glow under the room's soft lighting. The kind of instrument that professional pianists dreamed of playing. The kind of piano that Diego had only seen in concert halls and recording studios. He approached it slowly, almost reverently. The bench was positioned perfectly at exactly the right height. The lid was closed, protecting the keys, but Diego could see his reflection in the polished surface with trembling hands. He lifted the lid and folded it back, revealing the keyboard underneath. The keys were perfect. Bright white and deep black, clean and precisely aligned. Diego reached out and touched middle C with his index finger, pressing it so gently that it barely made a sound. The tone was incredible. Rich and warm and perfectly tuned. This piano had been maintained by professionals, probably serviced more regularly than most people service their cars. Diego sat down on the bench and placed his hands in playing position, fingers curved over the keys. It felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey, but when he tried to play the opening notes of Chopin's Sonata No. 1, his fingers stumbled. The muscle memory was there, but it was rusty, uncertain. His hands felt stiff and clumsy. After 5 years away from the keyboard, Diego tried again, playing just the first few measures. Better, but still not right. The timing was off, the touch uneven. What had once been as natural as breathing now felt forced and awkward. Panic began to set in. What if he couldn't do this? What if 5 years had been too long? What if he'd lost the ability that had once defined him? He forced himself to calm down. Of course it would take time. He hadn't expected to sit down and play perfectly after 5 years away. But how much time did he have? How long before someone discovered him? Here, Diego decided to start small. He began with simple scales, major and minor, running his fingers up and down the keyboard slowly and deliberately. The movements felt strange at first, but gradually his hands began to remember their old patterns after 30 minutes of scales and basic exercises. He felt confident enough to try a simple piece. He chose a Chopin waltz, something he'd learned early in his training. The melody came back to him easily, and his fingers found the right keys without too much trouble. Encouraged, Diego tried something more challenging. A batch invention full of complex fingerwork and precise timing. It took several attempts, but eventually he managed to play it all the way through. By the time he heard the security guard making his rounds in the hallway outside, Diego had been playing for almost 2 hours. He quickly closed the piano lid, turned off the lights, and slipped out of the room, his heart pounding from both excitement and fear of being caught. The next night, Diego returned to room 2105. This time he brought a small LED flashlight so he could keep the main lights off and avoid attracting attention. He also brought a notebook where he'd written down everything he could remember about Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The piece was incredibly complex. 15 minutes of music that required absolute precision and deep emotional understanding. Diego had found the recording online and listened to it during his lunch break. Trying to refresh his memory of the phrasing and dynamics, he started by working through the piece slowly, section by section. The opening theme came back to him fairly easily. It was the part he'd always loved most, deceptively simple but full of hidden emotion. His fingers seemed to remember where to go, even if they moved more slowly than they once had, but as he progressed to the more technically demanding sections, Diego realized how much work he had ahead of him. Passages that he'd once played effortlessly now required intense concentration. His left hand, which had to maintain complex bass patterns while his right hand played intricate melodies, felt completely uncoordinated. By the end of the second night, Diego could play about half the piece, though not at full tempo and not without mistakes. It was progress, but not enough. Not yet. Over the next week, Diego developed a routine. He would complete his regular cleaning duties as quickly as possible, then spend 2 hours in room 2105 working on the ballade. He practiced with the sound as soft as possible, barely touching the keys, afraid that someone might hear him. The improvement was gradual, but noticeable. Each night, his fingers moved a little more smoothly. The muscle memory was returning, slowly but surely. Passages that had seemed impossible on Monday were manageable by Friday, but Diego was still nowhere near performance level. The piece needed to be perfect, flawless, if he was going to present it to Victoria Sterling. And there were still sections that gave him trouble, technical challenges that would require weeks of practice to master. The hardest part wasn't technical, though. It was emotional. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a story told through music, full of passion and heartbreak and hope. Diego had once understood that story instinctively, had felt it in his bones. But 5 years of suppressing his musical dreams had left him emotionally numb to the piece. As he sat in the conference room late at night, playing the same passages over and over, Diego found himself thinking about what the music meant, about Chopin's own struggles as an artist, about the way beauty could emerge from suffering, about his own journey from promising musician to invisible janitor, and maybe, just maybe, back again. Slowly, the emotional connection began to return. Diego stopped thinking so much about finger placement and started thinking about what he wanted to say through the music. The notes began to flow more naturally, more expressively. After 2 weeks of secret practice sessions, Diego could play the entire ballade from beginning to end. Not perfectly and not at full performance tempo, but recognizably and musically. It was progress, but he knew he needed more time. The problem was that he couldn't keep this up indefinitely. Every night he spent in room 2105 was a risk. If security caught him, or if someone reported that piano music was coming from the executive floor, he would lose his job. And without his job, he couldn't support his mother or himself. But Diego was addicted now. Addicted to the feeling of music flowing through his fingers again. Addicted to the possibility that Victoria Sterling might actually honor her challenge. Addicted to the hope that maybe, just maybe, his dreams weren't dead after all. He decided to give himself 1 more week, 7 more nights to get the piece performance ready. If he couldn't master it by then, he would give up this crazy idea and go back to his regular life. But deep down, Diego knew he was past the point of no return. He'd awakened something inside himself that had been sleeping for 5 years. And now that it was awake, he wasn't sure he could put it back to sleep again. The music had found him again. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria Sterling's outburst in the lobby. Diego had been practicing every night, his fingers growing stronger and more confident with each session. The ballade was coming together, slowly but surely. He could now play it all the way through with only minor mistakes, and the emotional connection he'd once felt to the piece was returning, but doubt was creeping in. Had Victoria Sterling meant what she said? Did she even remember saying it? Diego had seen her around the building a few times during his evening shift, always looking perfectly composed and professional. She seemed like a different person from the frustrated woman who had shouted about Chopin in the empty lobby Friday evening. Diego was cleaning the 19th floor when he heard voices coming from the direction of the elevators. Executive assistants. Was staying late again, which usually meant important meetings or deadline pressure. He tried to work quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. "I don't care what his credentials look like on paper," a woman's voice said sharply. He spent the entire dinner talking about his golf handicap. His golf handicap. Do you know what the unemployment rate was in Poland when Chopin was composing? Do you know anything about the historical context of Romantic-era music? Diego recognized the voice immediately. Victoria Sterling, sounding even more frustrated than she had 3 weeks ago. "I understand your disappointment, Miss Sterling," another voice replied. It sounded like Janet, Victoria's executive assistant. "But perhaps your standards are a bit..." "Specific? Specific?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "I'm asking for basic cultural literacy. These men make millions of dollars and they can't tell Mozart from Metallic." Diego heard the elevator doors open, followed by the click of high heels on marble. "What about the tech entrepreneur from San Francisco?" Janet asked. He seemed genuinely interested in the arts. He asked me if I'd ever considered investing in a startup that makes apps for classical music. "An app, Janet? As if you could reduce centuries of human expression to swipe left, swipe right functionality." Their voices were getting closer. Diego quickly moved his cleaning cart to the side and focused intently on wiping down a conference room table, trying to look invisible. "Perhaps we should expand the search criteria," Janet suggested diplomatically. "Not everyone has extensive musical training." "I'm not asking for extensive musical training," Victoria replied. "I'm asking for someone who understands that there's more to life than quarterly earnings and stock options. Someone who can appreciate beauty, someone who has soul." They passed right by the conference room where Diego was working. Through the glass wall, he could see Victoria clearly for the first time in weeks. She looked tired, despite her perfect makeup and expensive suit. There were lines of frustration around her eyes. "What about the challenge you issued a few weeks ago?" Janet asked casually. "The Chopin thing?" Diego's hand froze on the cleaning cloth. They were talking about his challenge. Victoria's challenge. Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Oh, that... I was having a moment." Obviously, no one took it seriously. No one even responded? Of course not. It was a ridiculous thing to say. How many people in this building even know who Chopin is, let alone how to play his music? Diego felt something cold settle in his stomach. She hadn't meant it. Of course she hadn't meant it. It had been an emotional outburst, nothing more. He'd been practicing for 3 weeks, risking his job every night, chasing a fantasy that existed only in his own desperate imagination. "Still," Janet continued, "it would have been romantic if someone had taken you up on it, like something out of a movie." "Real life isn't a movie, Janet. Real life is disappointing men who think culture means knowing which wine costs the most." Their voices faded as they moved toward Victoria's office. Diego stood in the empty conference room, still holding his cleaning cloth, feeling like an idiot. What had he been thinking? That a billionaire CEO would actually marry her janitor because he could play piano? That Victoria Sterling, who had probably never noticed him in 3 years of working in her building, would suddenly fall in love with him over a piece of classical music. Diego finished cleaning the conference room mechanically, his mind spinning. He should forget about this whole thing. Go back to his normal routine, stop risking his job with these crazy late-night practice sessions. Victoria had made it clear that her challenge wasn't serious, but as he moved through the rest of his cleaning route, Diego couldn't stop thinking about what Victoria had said. She was looking for someone who understood beauty, who had soul. Someone who could appreciate more than just money and status. Diego understood beauty. He'd spent years of his life studying it, creating it, living it through music. He might not have millions of dollars or fancy credentials. But he had something that all of Victoria's wealthy suitors apparently lacked. He had the ability to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 with real feeling, real understanding. By the time Diego finished his regular duties, he'd made a decision. Maybe Victoria hadn't meant her challenge seriously. Maybe she would laugh at him or call security, but he had to try. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he'd been brave enough to take her at her word. Diego checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. The executive floor would be mostly empty by now, but Victoria often worked late. There was a chance she was still in her office. He took the elevator to the 20th floor, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the security cameras could see it. Victoria's office was at the far end of the hall, behind double doors marked with her name in elegant gold lettering. Light was still visible under the doors. She was there. Diego stood outside those doors for a full 5 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock. His janitor's uniform suddenly felt like a costume, completely inappropriate for what he was about to do. His hands, still rough from years of manual labor, seemed wrong for someone who was about to claim he could play classical piano. But those same hands had been making music again for 3 weeks. Those same hands remembered every note of Chopin's most beautiful ballade. Even if the rest of the world had forgotten that Diego had ever been a musician, he knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Victoria's voice called from inside. Diego opened the door and stepped into the most elegant office he'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Original artwork covered the walls. Victoria's desk was a work of art itself, carved from what looked like a single piece of dark wood. Victoria was sitting behind that desk, reading financial reports under the light of an expensive lamp. She didn't look up immediately, clearly expecting Janet or another assistant. "Just leave the documents on the side table," she said without raising her eyes. "I'll review them in the morning." "Miss Sterling," Diego said quietly, "I'm not here about documents." Victoria looked up then, and Diego saw the exact moment when she realized who was standing in her office. Her eyebrows rose in surprise, and she set down the papers she'd been reading. "I'm sorry, you single quotes re. Diego, isn't it? The janitor?" She knew his name. Somehow, that made him feel both better and worse. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you so late. I know you're busy." Victoria glanced at her watch, clearly puzzled by this unprecedented visit. "Is there a problem with the building? Something that needs immediate attention?" "No, ma'am, nothing like that." Diego took a deep breath. "I'm here about your challenge. The one you made 3 weeks ago in the lobby." For a moment, Victoria looked completely blank. Then understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by embarrassment. "Oh, that." She leaned back in her chair, studying Diego with new interest. "You were there? You heard that?" "Yes, ma'am. You said that if any man in this building could play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 perfectly, you would marry him." Victoria's expression shifted from embarrassment to something that might have been amusement. "I did say that, didn't I? I was having a rather difficult day." "I understand if you didn't mean it seriously," Diego said quickly. "But I wanted you to know that I can play that piece, and if you'd be willing to listen, I'd like to play it for you." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Diego could almost see her trying to process this surreal situation. Her janitor standing in her office at midnight, claiming he could play classical piano. "You're serious," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am." "You actually know how to play Chopin?" "I do." Victoria stood up from behind her desk, moving around to face Diego directly. She was smaller than she seemed from a distance, but her presence was still commanding. "This is quite possibly the strangest conversation I've ever had in this office," she said. "And I once had a merger discussion with a man who insisted on conducting the entire meeting in Shakespearean English." Despite his nervousness, Diego almost smiled. "I imagine it is strange, ma'am." Victoria studied him for another long moment, and Diego had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just as part of the building's invisible maintenance staff, but as an actual person with his own story. "All right," she said finally. "I'll listen. But I should warn you, I know that piece very well. I'll know if you're faking it." Diego nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." "There's a piano in the conference room down the hall. I assume you know where it is." The walk down the hallway to room 2105 felt like the longest journey of Diego's life. Victoria Sterling walked beside him in complete silence, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Diego could feel her studying him, probably wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke, or if her janitor had simply lost his mind. Diego's hands were shaking as he unlocked the conference room door. He'd been in this room dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, but never with an audience. Never with someone whose opinion would determine whether this moment was the beginning of something incredible or the end of everything he dared to. Hope for Victoria entered the room and moved directly to the windows, gazing out at the city lights while Diego turned on the soft accent lighting. The piano sat in the corner exactly as he'd left it the night before, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of the lamps. "It's a beautiful instrument," Victoria said, approaching the piano. "I had it installed when we renovated this floor. Most of our international clients appreciate classical music, and I thought it would add an elegant touch to our negotiations." She ran her fingers along the piano's edge, and Diego noticed that her touch was gentle, respectful. This wasn't just an expensive piece of furniture to her. "Do you play?" Diego asked. "A little. I took lessons as a child, but I never had the patience for serious study." Victoria looked at him directly. "I'm much better at listening than performing." Diego nodded and approached the piano bench. His whole body was trembling now, not just his hands. 3 weeks of secret practice had led to this moment, but suddenly he felt completely unprepared. "Before you begin," Victoria said, "I should tell you something. I wasn't entirely honest earlier when I said no one had responded to my challenge." Diego's heart sank. Someone else had already tried. Someone had already failed or succeeded, or 3 men sent recordings, Victoria continued. Professional recordings they'd clearly downloaded from the internet. Another 2 hired musicians to perform for them while they pretended to play. It was disappointing. Diego felt a mix of relief and increased pressure. He was really playing, but the bar had been set impossibly high by Victoria's previous disappointments. "I hope you understand," Victoria said, settling into one of the leather chairs near the piano, "that I'll know immediately if you're not really playing. I've heard this piece performed by some of the world's best pianists." "I understand," Diego replied, sitting down at the bench. He adjusted the height slightly, a habit from his conservatory days, and placed his hands over the keys. For a moment he just sat there, feeling the familiar weight of his fingers on the keyboard. The room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Victoria was watching him intently, probably expecting him to begin immediately, but Diego had learned something during his years at Juilliard. The most important part of any performance wasn't the first note. It was the silence before the first note. The moment when the performer connected with the music, when the outside world fell away and there was nothing left but the story waiting to be told. Diego closed his eyes and let himself remember the first time he'd heard Chopin's Ballade No. 1. He'd been 17, sitting in a dark concert hall when a visiting pianist had played it as an encore. The music had washed over him like a revelation, complex and emotional and absolutely beautiful. He'd known in that moment that he had to learn to play it himself. When Diego finally began, the opening notes filled the conference room with a warmth that seemed to change the very air. The melody was deceptively simple at first, almost conversational, like Chopin was introducing himself to a friend. But even in those early measures, there were hints of the complexity to come. Diego had forgotten how good it felt to play for someone else. For 3 weeks, he'd been practicing alone, focusing on technique and accuracy. But with Victoria listening, the music came alive in a way it hadn't during his solitary sessions. He could feel her attention, her genuine engagement with what he was playing. As the piece developed, Diego's confidence grew. His fingers found their old fluidity, moving across the keys with increasing assurance. The technical passages that had given him so much trouble in practice now flowed naturally, his muscle memory fully awakened after its 5-year sleep. But it was the emotional content of the music that surprised Diego most. As he played, memories flooded back, not just of his conservatory days, but of everything that had happened since. His mother's illness, the impossible choice he'd made, the years of sacrifice and compromise. All of it was there in Chopin's music. Transformed into something beautiful, the ballade told a story of struggle and triumph, of dreams deferred but not destroyed. It spoke of love and loss, of hope rising from despair. As Diego played, he realized he was telling his own story through Chopin's notes. About halfway through the piece, Diego glanced up and saw that Victoria had moved closer to the piano. She was standing now, leaning against the instrument, her eyes closed as she listened. Her expression had changed completely from the skeptical, guarded look she'd worn when they entered the room. She looked peaceful, moved to technical challenges in the middle section of the ballade. Had once been Diego's greatest obstacle, but tonight they felt effortless. His left hand danced through the complex bass patterns while his right hand sang the soaring melody. Years of physical labor had actually strengthened his hands, giving him a power and endurance he'd never had as a young student. As the piece built toward its dramatic climax, Diego felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Complete and total connection with the music, the kind of transcendent moment that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with piano in the first place. The conference room disappeared. Victoria disappeared. The entire world narrowed down to just Diego and the piano and Chopin's incredible music. The final section of the ballade was the most demanding, requiring absolute precision and emotional maturity. Diego had struggled with it during practice, never quite managing to capture the perfect balance between technical brilliance and heartfelt expression. But tonight, with Victoria listening, everything clicked into place. The ending of the piece was like a question mark, unresolved and haunting. Chopin had written it that way deliberately, leaving the listener to wonder what came next. As Diego played the final notes, he let them hang in the air for a long moment before lifting his hands from the keys. The silence that followed was profound. Diego sat at the piano bench, suddenly aware that his shirt was damp with perspiration and his heart was racing. He just played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 all the way through, without a single significant mistake, for the first time in 5 years. More importantly, he'd played it well, really well. The kind of performance that would have earned approval from his old professors at Juilliard. Victoria remained motionless for several seconds, her eyes still closed. When she finally opened them and looked at Diego, her expression was unreadable. That was ... She began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. Diego waited, hardly daring to breathe. Had it been good enough? Had she believed his playing? Had she been moved by it, or was she simply trying to think of a polite way to dismiss him? That was extraordinary, Victoria said finally. Absolutely extraordinary. Diego felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. Thank you. Where did you learn to play like that? Victoria asked, moving around the piano to face him directly. That wasn't amateur playing, Diego. That was professional level. Concert level. I studied at Juilliard, Diego said quietly. For 3 years, Victoria's eyes widened. Juilliard? The Juilliard school? Yes, ma'am. What happened? Why didn't you finish? Diego hesitated. This was the part of his story he'd never told anyone at work, the part that revealed just how far he'd fallen from his original dreams. My mother got sick, he said simply. Cancer. The treatment was expensive and she needed someone to take care of her. I had to choose between finishing school and making sure she survived. Understanding dawned in Victoria's eyes. So you gave up music to save your mother's life? It wasn't really a choice, Diego replied. She raised me alone, worked 2 jobs to pay for my lessons. When she needed help, there was no question what I had to do. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Diego could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. He wasn't just the building's janitor anymore. He was a man who had sacrificed his dreams for his family, who had given up a promising career to do what was right. Is she ... Does your mother all right now? Victoria asked. Yes, healthy and working. The medical bills are paid off. She's been encouraging me to go back to music, but double quote, Diego shrugged. It's been 5 years. I thought it was too late. Too late? Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a mocking sound. Diego, do you have any idea how good you just sounded? That performance was flawless, more than flawless. It was inspired. Diego felt his face flush with pleasure. It had been so long since anyone had praised his playing, since anyone had even known he could play. You said in your challenge that, if someone could play this piece perfectly, you would marry them, Diego said carefully. Did you mean that? Victoria's expression grew serious. I did say that, didn't I? Yes, ma'am. And you believe you've met the terms of that challenge? I hope so. Victoria Sterling stood by the window for what felt like an eternity, her silhouette framed against the glittering city lights. Diego remained at the piano bench, his hands still trembling slightly from the performance, waiting for her response. To his honest answer, when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. 5 years, she said, not turning around. You gave up 5 years of your life for your mother. It wasn't a sacrifice, Diego replied automatically. It was family. Of course it was a sacrifice. Victoria turned to face him, and Diego was surprised to see something that looked like tears in her eyes. Don't diminish what you did. You had a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. You had talent that could have taken you anywhere. And you gave it all up without hesitation. Diego shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. He wasn't used to this kind of recognition, this kind of understanding of what his choice had cost him. Miss Sterling, Victoria, she corrected. I think we're past formalities at this point. Victoria, Diego said carefully, testing how her name felt in his mouth. I need to know something. When you made that challenge, did you really mean it? About marriage? Victoria moved away from the window and sat down in one of the leather chairs, studying Diego intently. I meant it when I said it. I was frustrated, angry at all these wealthy men who couldn't tell Chopin from pop music. I wanted someone who understood beauty, who had depth, who cared about something more than stock portfolios. And now? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Now I realized that my challenge was impulsive and unfair. To both of us, Diego felt his heart sink. Of course, what had he expected? That a billionaire would actually marry her janitor based on a moment of anger and a piano performance. I understand, he said, starting to stand up from the bench. No, wait. Victoria held up her hand. Let me finish. It was unfair because marriage should be based on love, on genuine compatibility, on knowing someone deeply. Not on a single moment, no matter how beautiful. Diego nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. She was right, of course. It had been a fantasy to think otherwise. But, Victoria continued, that doesn't mean I want to just pretend this never happened. What do you mean? Victoria leaned forward in her chair, her expression intense. Diego, what you just played was extraordinary. I've heard professional concerts that weren't as moving as what you just did in this conference room. You have a gift that the world deserves to hear. That's very kind of you to say, but it's not kindness, it's fact. Victoria stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly working. Tell me something. If money weren't an issue, if you didn't have to worry about supporting yourself or your mother, what would you want to do with your life? The question caught Diego off guard. No one had asked him about his dreams in years. He'd gotten so used to thinking in terms of necessity and survival that he'd almost forgotten how to think about what he actually wanted. I would want to finish my degree at Juilliard, he said slowly. I would want to perform, maybe teach. I always thought about opening a music school in my neighborhood, somewhere kids like me could learn even if their families couldn't afford expensive lessons. Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him directly. What if I could make that possible? I don't understand. What if I could fund your return to Juilliard? Cover your tuition, your living expenses, your mother's ongoing healthcare costs? What? If I could give you the chance to pursue your dreams without financial worry. Diego stared at her, unable to process what she was suggesting. Why would you do that? Because you deserve it. Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted cleaning office buildings, no matter how well you do it. Victoria's voice grew passionate. Diego, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I donate millions to charity every year, fund scholarships, support the arts. But I've never had the chance to directly help someone reclaim their dreams. I couldn't accept that, Diego said automatically. It's too much. Why not? Because I haven't done anything to earn it. Because you barely know me. Because it wouldn't be right. Victoria sat back down, her expression gentling. You haven't done anything to earn it? You sacrificed your career to save your mother's life. You've worked 3 years in a job that was beneath your abilities without complaint. You risked everything. Tonight, to honor a challenge that most people would have dismissed as the ravings of an overwrought executive. She paused, looking directly into his eyes. And you just gave me the most beautiful 15 minutes I've experienced in years. Do you have any idea how long it's been since I've heard music played with that kind of genuine emotion? Most of the concerts I attend are social obligations, performances by technically skilled musicians who play perfectly but say nothing. Diego felt overwhelmed by her words, by the possibility she was offering. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Say you'll consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to reclaim your dreams. Victoria, I appreciate this more than I can express, but why? Really why? This is about more than just my performance tonight. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider how honest to be. You want to know the truth? She said finally. I've been running this company for 8 years. I've made more money than my great-grandchildren could spend. I've acquired companies, built buildings, created jobs for thousands of people. And I'm proud of that work. She stood up and walked back to the piano, running her fingers along its edge. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why any of it mattered. I started measuring everything in terms of profit margins and market share. I forgot that the point of having resources is to use them for something meaningful. Victoria looked up at Diego. Tonight, watching you play, seeing someone risk everything for the chance to make something beautiful, it reminded me of what I've been missing. You reminded me that there are things more valuable than money. What things? Courage, sacrifice, the willingness to choose love over security. Victoria's voice grew softer. Your mother is incredibly lucky to have a son like you. Diego felt his eyes welling up. No one had ever spoken about his choices that way, with such understanding and respect. If you really mean this offer, he said carefully, if you're really willing to help me return to music, then I have a condition. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to make conditions, Diego. Maybe not. But I need to say this. Anyway, Diego stood up from the piano bench and faced her directly. If you help me, it can't be charity. It has to be an investment. What do you mean? I mean that someday, when I'm successful, when I'm earning money from music again, I want to pay you back. Every penny. And more than that, I want to help you. Create that music school I mentioned. For kids who need the same kind of chance you'd be giving me. Victoria stared at him for a moment, then smiled. It was the first genuine smile Diego had ever seen from her. You're serious about this? Completely serious. If we do this, we do it as partners. You invest in my future, and I use that future to help others the way you're helping me. And if I refuse those conditions? Diego took a deep breath. Then I politely decline your offer and go back to my regular life, with gratitude for this moment, but no regrets. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Diego could see her reassessing him once again. Not as a charity case or a romantic fantasy, but as an equal. Someone with his own principles and his own vision for the future. You know, she said finally, 37 wealthy, educated men have tried to impress me over the past 6 months. Not one of them offered to be my partner in anything meaningful. I'm not trying to impress you, Diego said. I'm trying to be honest with you. I know. That's what makes all the difference. Victoria extended her hand toward Diego. Partners? Diego looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face. Her expression was serious but warm, genuine in a way he'd never seen from her before. Partners? he agreed, taking her hand in his dot as they shook hands in the elegant conference room. With Chopin's piano still resonating in the air around them, Diego realized that this moment was nothing like what he'd imagined when he first heard. Victoria's challenge. It was better, it was real. And it was just the beginning. 6 months later, Diego stood backstage at Lincoln Center, adjusting his bow tie for the third time in 5 minutes. His hands, which had been steady enough to play the most complex passages of Chopin just an hour earlier during his final sound, now trembled with nervous energy. Tonight was his comeback performance, his first public concert in 6 years. The program featured the piece that had started it all, Chopin's Ballade No. 1, along with several other works that had special meaning to him. But more than just a recital, tonight represented the culmination of the most extraordinary 6 months of his life. True to her word, Victoria had funded his return to Juilliard, but it had been more complicated than either of them had initially expected. After 5 years away, Diego couldn't simply re-enroll where he'd left off. He'd had to audition again, prove that his skills were still at conservatory level, convince skeptical professors that he was serious about returning to music. The audition had been terrifying. Diego had played for a panel of faculty members who'd heard thousands of talented students over the years. Many of them remembered him from his earlier time at the school, which added an extra layer of pressure. Everyone wanted to know why he'd left what he'd been doing, whether he could still perform at the level they demanded. Diego had played Chopin's Ballade No. 1, of course, but he'd also prepared Bach, Mozart, and a contemporary piece that pushed his technical abilities to their limits. When he finished, the room had been silent for a long moment. "Well," Professor Weinstein had said finally, "I'd say the last 5 years have given you something most of our students lack." "What's that?" Diego had asked. "Life experience, emotional maturity. Your playing has a depth now that it didn't have before." Diego had been readmitted to Juilliard with full standing, eligible to complete his degree with just 1 additional year of study. But Victoria's support had gone far beyond tuition payments. She'd insisted on covering all his living expenses, his mother's ongoing healthcare costs, and even the cost of a high-quality piano for his apartment, more than the financial support. Though Victoria had become a genuine friend and artistic collaborator, she'd attended his lessons when her schedule permitted, offering feedback and encouragement. She'd connected him with other musicians and introduced him to the classical music community in New York. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Not the impulsive marriage that Victoria had originally promised, but something deeper and more meaningful. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a common commitment to using their resources and talents to make a difference. "Diego?" a voice called from behind him. 5 minutes to curtain. Diego nodded to the stage manager and took a deep breath. He could hear the audience settling into their seats beyond the curtain. 300 people had come to hear him play tonight, including music critics, fellow students, and donors who supported emerging artists, but there were 3 people in that audience whose presence meant everything to him. His mother, Carmen, was sitting in the front row, wearing her best dress and the pearl earrings. Diego had bought her with his first paycheck from a part-time teaching job he'd taken at a community music center. She'd cried when he'd told her about his return to music, overwhelmed with joy and guilt in equal measure. "Mio, I never wanted you to give up your dreams for me," she'd said through her tears. "I know, Mama, but if I hadn't, I never would have learned what really matters, and I never would have met someone who could help me find my way back." Victoria was also in the audience, seated in the 3rd row. She'd wanted to sit closer, but Diego had convinced her that too much attention on their partnership might overshadow the music itself. The press had gotten wind of their story. Billionaire CEO helps former janitor return to music, and Diego was still learning how to handle the media attention. The 3rd person in the audience was someone Diego had never met, but whose presence felt especially meaningful tonight. A 12-year-old girl named Sofia Rodriguez, who would be the first student admitted to the Diego Morales Music Academy when it opened next fall. The academy was Victoria and Diego's joint project, the partnership. They discussed that night in the conference room. It would provide free music education to children from low-income families, offering the same kind of opportunities that had once seemed impossible for kids like Diego. Sofia had auditioned for the academy 3 months earlier, playing a simple piece on a battered keyboard in the community center where Diego now taught part-time. Her technique was rough, her instrument inadequate, but she played with such genuine love for the music that Diego had immediately known she belonged in their program. "I want to play like you someday," Sofia had told him after her audition. "I want to make people feel happy when they hear me play." Tonight's concert was not just Diego's comeback. It was also a fundraiser for the academy, with all proceeds going toward instruments, supplies, and scholarships for students like Sofia. The stage manager appeared at Diego's side. "Ready?" Diego nodded and walked toward the curtain. As he stepped onto the stage, the applause was warm and welcoming. The lights were bright enough that he couldn't see individual faces in the audience, but he could feel their energy, their anticipation. The Steinway Grand Piano Center stage was identical to the one in Victoria's conference room, the instrument where he'd rediscovered his love for performance. Diego had requested this specific model, and Victoria had made sure it was available. Diego sat at the piano bench and adjusted his position. The audience fell silent, waiting. For a moment, Diego allowed himself to think about the journey that had brought him here. 5 years ago, he'd thought his musical career was over forever. 6 months ago, he'd been a janitor who practiced in secret, afraid of being caught pursuing impossible dreams. Now he was here, in one of the world's most prestigious concert halls, about to perform for an audience that included music critics, industry professionals, and people who'd paid substantial ticket prices to hear him play. But more importantly, he was here as himself. Not as someone trying to impress or prove anything, but as a musician who'd learned that the most beautiful music comes from genuine emotion, from real life experience, from the understanding that love and sacrifice and hope are the raw materials from which art is made. Diego placed his hands over the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the concert hall, the same melody that had changed everything 6 months earlier. But tonight, the music carried new meaning. It spoke not just of dreams deferred, but of dreams reclaimed. Not just of love lost, but of love discovered in unexpected places. As Diego played, he thought about his mother in the front row, finally, seeing her son fulfill the potential she'd always believed in. He thought about Victoria,